Welcome to the Urbanist Agenda, the podcast that wants more housing and cheaper housing too. This is Jason from Not Just Bikes, and I'm joined today by Mike Moffatt. How should I introduce you, Mike?
I would say I am Jason Slaughter's elementary school classmate. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, we've known each other for a long time, and it's quite funny because on a few things we kind of interacted with each other on Twitter in our various professional lives, and it's been very funny.
It has, yeah. No, if you had asked me, and I won't say the number, but if you asked me X number of years ago when we met each other, I don't think any of us thought we would be here or still doing the same thing. But beyond that, Canadian housing expert. I'm a senior director of a think tank called the Smart Prosperity Institute. And most importantly, I'm co-host of the podcast Missing Middle, where we talk about the challenges facing the young urban middle class in Canada. And obviously a big one's housing.
Yeah, and this is incredibly relevant to a large chunk of my audience. I actually noticed, I was looking at the stats, that the percentage of Canadians that listen to this podcast is higher than the percentage of Canadians that watch my YouTube channel. So that is kind of interesting. Very relevant.
Well, absolutely. Well, I've discussed this. I think a lot of Canadians look to the Netherlands for solutions, probably incorrectly, but yeah,
we can get to that.
I could see this big popular in Canada. There's actually surprisingly few Canadian podcasts that deal with these issues. So it's been kind of nice for us at Missing Middle to kind of fill that vacuum. There hasn't been a whole lot of competition.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to have you on here so that we can talk about housing. I don't talk about housing that much on my YouTube channel. I've kind of touched on it tangentially, talking about how we need to get rid of minimum parking requirements and restrictive zoning, and we need to build more transit-oriented development. I talk about it in that context, but I don't really talk about the housing crisis. There's a few reasons for that. One is because I am certainly not an expert, and it's a very politically and emotionally charged issue, and that is something that I could only step on landmines in. But what I find interesting is that I've gone back and looked at the stats on various occasions, and whether the housing crisis is worse in the Netherlands or Canada kind of depends on what assumptions you make and what date you start at. They're both terrible. But I know you're not an expert in why things are a problem here in the Netherlands, but let's talk about why the housing crisis is so bad in Canada. And some of those things are going to be in common.
Yeah, absolutely. I would suggest that Canada's probably has the worst housing crisis in the world, or is quite up there.
Yeah.
And the challenges that we have are really not that much different than other Anglo-American countries.
The Dutch are going to take offense to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Some guy in New Zealand's going to get all pissed off.
All right.
But I describe it as an issue around good intentions, really, that if I'm going to give a fake London example because we're both fake Londoners.
Yeah, I hope that we go off on lots of fake London tangents here and talk about very specific things. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'll be remember when Mayor Gosnell did that thing? But going back in 2004, my then girlfriend, now wife Hannah, and I bought our first home. And it was a brand new, single detached, 3-bedroom home, Adelaide and Sunningdale, for you fake Londoners, kind of in the northeast end of the city.
Yeah.
Where, cornfields had just been a year before, right? This is right on the edge of town. And a lot of those subdivisions had popped up all over. And London wasn't that much different than any other town or city in Ontario. Anyhow, brand new home, 3-bedroom, 2-story. $168,000, which at the time I thought was a lot, but really, you're looking at 2 to 3 times average or median family income at the time. So definitely quite affordable. But the challenge is if you go and actually look at that neighborhood, it's not walkable, right? It's at the time out in the middle of nowhere. And how we built all of this housing was to basically just expand urban growth boundaries, right? Whenever we needed more housing, we just saw, okay, well, there's a bunch of cornfields or wheat fields over there. Let's just pave over that.
I remember that actually when I was a teenager, didn't totally understand this stuff, but I remember there were always these things in the news about how London was annexing this and annexing that. So it was we're annexing this town and annexing that town. And what that was effectively meaning, it was just sprawling bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. And the incentives get weird there because one of the things that happens, we're going to go off on a big tangent here, but one of the things that happens with urban development in Ontario in particular is that taxes, things like development charges and other taxes, tend to be less expensive in rural areas than actually within municipal centers.
Yeah.
So a lot of growth actually happens just outside of the city. So you don't even get suburban sprawl. You get this kind of ex-urban sprawl.
Yeah.
Where then people, buy these homes and then, drive a half hour to their job to save money on taxes and that kind of thing, which is problematic for the city because they don't get any tax revenue from that.
Yeah, the exurbs is something that I've had trouble explaining to Dutch people, even in person, where I'll be like, yeah, they build this neighborhood like in the middle of nowhere. And they're like, oh, like on the edge of the city? I'm like, no, literally in the middle of nowhere. Like you go down a country road and then boom, there will be like this subdivision of like 35 homes or 50 homes or whatever. And that's it. It's in a square. And there is literally nothing there. There's no school. There's no shops. There's nothing except this block of houses that some developer bought up a cornfield and said, boom, here's a bunch of houses. And that's it. And then you're left to be like, figure it out, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that here even in large, like if you go to the city of Ottawa, where I'm currently living, like you have the city, then you have this kind of green belt around the city. Then you have like more suburban developments on the other side of the green belt. Then you keep driving and you have nothing for like 20, 30 minutes. And then you get to the next town over called Carleton Place. And then boom, you have this whole town again. And most of the folks who live in Carleton Place don't actually work in Carleton Place. They drive to Ottawa every day, or if they're lucky, they work from home. And it's just this massive tax dodge, basically, and it creates this massive sprawl. So go back to the earlier part. What cities do to avoid that is to annex the towns around them so they can actually capture that revenue and actually kind of slow down that sprawl. But to the original point, basically what happened over time was we realized back in 2004, like, hey, this form of development really isn't great. It's causing all kinds of environmental issues. It's affecting the sustainability of city finances.
Yeah, well, like that goes exactly to my Strong Towns playlist and all the stuff Strong Towns talks about. But it's like, yeah, you can come in as a developer and boom, build this thing, and the city will put some plumbing out there and electrical and stuff. But then who's going to maintain it when it needs to be replaced in 30 years? Because the people have moved there because it was cheaper, especially in terms of like property taxes. So there's no money that was saved up to replace any of this infrastructure, to maintain any of this infrastructure. So these exurbs just become like, they're screwed.
Absolutely. And that's what we sort of recognized. So over time, provincial and municipal governments go, hey, this is not sustainable. This doesn't make any sense. So we're going to do a few things. Like we create these tighter urban growth boundaries so we don't allow cities to just kind of expand outwards indefinitely. For rural areas, we could create things called green belts, which are basically land set-asides that, stay as farms or forests or wetlands or whatever they are. But we also hike things called development charges, which are supposed to pay for that infrastructure so that you don't run into these financial issues. But the challenge is, so we got really good at figuring out how not to build housing, and we stopped doing a lot of that really stupid stuff. But we never legalized the good stuff, right? So we made it really difficult to build missing middle housing downtown. We have all these parking minimums, lot size minimums, and so on. So it's that challenge of, okay, we stopped doing bad housing. Fantastic idea, but we never created the conditions to do good housing. And then you couple that with population boom in many of these Anglo-American countries. It's like, okay, we've made it really difficult to create housing at the same time where housing is more needed than ever before.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the idea of the green belt and the urban growth boundaries works very well, but it only works if it's done at like a large provincial level or something. If it's only done like one city's going to do it, then yeah, people are just going to have leapfrog development that just goes on the other side of it. But all of those things you talked about, that is exactly some of the things that I've talked about in the channel that Strong Towns talked about quite regularly. It's that this whole missing middle, and it's basically illegal to build better housing. And I see it every time I go back to London, Ontario. I see these neighborhoods that just sprawl and sprawl and sprawl. Every time I go there, there's some new neighborhood that they plop down on the edge of town. But then I also see these condo buildings that are like 15 to 20 stories high that'll just be like randomly plopped in between the suburban neighborhoods, which is just so bizarre, right? Because then you basically got this condo building, but there's still nothing around it. It's still just like right next to a suburban neighborhood. There's nothing in between. There's nothing between the single family home and the 10, 20-story condo building. And everybody needs to drive everywhere still. It's like really, really bad.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you described it sort of off camera before we went on that we're creating this kind of car-dependent density, right? Yeah. Where we stick these towers out in the middle of nowhere. and they're not walkable. There's nowhere you can go to. Occasionally, you might get some ground floor retail on the first floor, but even then, there's not much.
Well, it's unlikely to be a grocery store or anything useful. It's more likely to be a Starbucks or something.
Yeah. Well, I'd say Starbucks is quite useful, but that's just my coffee habits. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you're lucky, you might be able to get a coffee and a pack of smokes at the convenience store next door. But, if you want a 4-liter bag of milk, because we do that in Ontario, you're having to drive to the Walmart or wherever. So yeah, it's just a bananas form of development, but all of the sort of incentives we have created make that, right? That it's hard to get a building, just in general, it's hard to get any kind of building built in Canada, just all of the regulatory processes you have to go through. So you're not going to create like 3 6-story buildings when you create 1 18-story buildings, right? Because there's just so much cost, regulatory cost and uncertainty. So you get all of these developers going, well, I don't want to go through 10 different regulatory process. I'll just build, 1 gigantic tower outside of town with a massive parking garage because, maybe if we're lucky, we might get 2 buses a day going out there. So yeah, it's really poorly thought through. And again, it just comes to this challenge of we're good at figuring out what not to do. We've been less good at figuring out what to do.
Yeah, it's just really shocking to me. But you exactly said it there. The issue is that it's so hard to get anything built that the only people who can build anything is a developer that builds a giant condo. Because that's the only way that it can be cost effective, to go through all of the red tape, to go through all of the development approvals and everything else. Like, nobody's going to do that unless they can make a huge amount of money out of it. But it's also like ridiculous that so Toronto has finally changed this, that they've made it possible to build triplexes, I think it is.
Yeah, up to 4plexes now.
Oh, up to 4plexes. Yeah. Okay. I still think it would be better to be beyond that, but baby steps here, right? So at least now a single person or a small company could potentially come along and buy a couple of homes and then turn them into 4plexes, right? So they could turn 1 home into 4 apartments, which is a big step up. But that's still relatively uncommon in Ontario.
Yeah, it is. So, I mean, that's been largely legalized. We have something in Canada called the Housing Accelerator, which is a initiative by the federal government to try and change the incentives at the municipal level. So basically what it does is the federal government goes, hey, municipalities, you're constantly broke. We will, give you some one-time injection of funds, but in exchange, we want a set of municipal reforms. And 4plexes is often one that they've asked for. The challenge is, just because on paper a 4plex is legal doesn't mean that you necessarily get a 4plex, right? Because if you have things like parking minimums, say, okay, yeah, you can have a 4plex, but every unit needs to have a parking spot.
Well, often 1.2 or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Or, yeah, you can do this, but you need, such and such a setback from the street. You have this, height limit, all of these other kind of limits on it. Plus, each one of those 4 units has an independent development charge on it. So you're getting taxed 4 times on it. To build infrastructure, even though you're building the 4plex in an existing neighborhood that probably has a school that's only 2/3 being used, because, everybody living in that neighborhood, the average age is about 80. So you put all of these other restrictions on it. It's like, yeah, something could be legal on paper, but it doesn't mean it actually gets built unless all of those other conditions are met.
Yeah, and those parking minimums in particular really, really have to go. Like, those hold back new development more than anything. The idea that you are required to build off-street parking spaces is so prevalent. We actually have it here in the Netherlands too, far too often. I mean, they're much, much lower, but there are still places that have it here too, and it just does not make sense.
Well, and I'll give you a perfect example of that. One that went through, so again, I currently live in the city of Ottawa. We had one, it was an affordable housing development right by an LRT station. And they were having trouble getting it built because the city kept pushing back for having more parking spaces. And I'm like, this is an affordable housing development right by an LRT. Like, we don't need places for people on what we call Ontario Works, which is welfare, in order to park their Tesla. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. But it's just this, web of rules that we've created over time. And those are the projects that it blocks most, right? We often hear like, oh, greedy developers, they don't want to do X, Y, Z because it will affect their profit margins. But The folks that get hit most are the not-for-profits, right? Because they have no margin, right? But they still have to break even. And all of these rules and requirements, absolutely limit the ability for these groups to build more housing.
Yeah, and on affordable housing and subsidized housing, which we need a lot more of, we used to do that a lot more in Canada, and we didn't for a while. I mean, that's the same story here in the Netherlands. When I read back about the neighborhood I live in, which is Zoud, which was a planned neighborhood called Plan Zoud, and a big part of it was subsidized housing. And there were buildings that were built just for that, and they were also scattered throughout all the other homes. The people who lived directly right next door to us, it's an apartment of 3, and all of them are subsidized housing. So it's like all mixed in everywhere. And now it wasn't built much in the intervening years when you go through like the 90s, for example. And there just wasn't enough subsidized housing being built. And Canada was exactly the same thing. So is that changing in Canada? Like, where's that going?
Yeah, a little bit. So Canada really stopped building a lot of that stuff in the late 80s. We had a bad recession in early 1990s, and the federal government around 1995 went through a big austerity agenda. We had a fairly high government debt at the time. There was worries about our ability to continue to finance that debt. So the Chrétien government, basically scaled back massively, well, actually to zero the amount of social housing, left it to the provinces. And some provinces like Quebec actually continued to build some. Ontario was led by a conservative government at the time, which I think you and I remember well.
Yes. The same people that filled in the Queen subway, for what it's worth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or Eglinton subway. But yeah.
But the provincial government basically downloaded that responsibility onto municipalities who are generally broke. So what municipalities did instead was do things like inclusionary zoning, basically going, hey, we don't have money for social housing, but we'll go to private developers and say, hey, you've got, your zone to build this up to 18 stories. If you put in some affordable housing, we'll put that up to 22 and so on. We're kind of works in theory, but a lot of times the math just doesn't work. And what ends up happening is that you lose both social housing and the actual market rate housing. That started to change a few years ago. The federal government back in 2017 came up with a national housing strategy, which is focused on building more non-market social housing, a little bit of co-ops. The challenge is just the amount of money involved, right? Like we have a housing shortage, depending on who you ask, of about 2 to 3 million units. And then, you go and see a government minister, do a ribbon cutting somewhere of some social housing project with like 18 units. It's like, okay, that's good. That's 18 more units than we would have had otherwise. But it really hasn't met the scale of the challenge.
Yeah. And you actually touched on something there that I did want to talk about, because I have friends who work in the city of Toronto, and they tell me, for example, when I talk to them about this is just so ridiculous. They have all of this red tape and requirements that you have to jump through in order to build anything. And their answer is pretty clear. They're like, oh, yeah, they keep them in there on purpose because they use them as a negotiating chip for developers. Because developer comes in, and says, I want to build a 9,000 story unit right in the middle of here. And they'll be like, no, you can't do that. But, we'll take away this if you do this. And, that's what they start doing. They'll be like, yeah, I know we say we need this much parking, but we'll let you do half as much and, build your parking garage lower if you do these things that we want. And that is the bargaining chip. That's great. But then it also just makes it harder for anybody other than the biggest companies to actually get anything through.
Yeah. I mean, at times it does feel a bit like an extortion racket, right? Where you're going, oh, nice building you have there, nice blueprint you have there. If you want to build it, we need these 17 things.
Right.
But at the same time, again, municipalities are broke. They really don't have a lot of funding tools. So they have to use any tool imaginable. But I think the challenge is because everything becomes a negotiation, right? And everything becomes very subjective. And whenever you have anything like that, and it could be these building rules, it could be urban growth boundaries, it could be the green belt, it creates the conditions for corruption, right? When you don't have a set of black and white rules, but everything becomes a negotiation with another human, and the terms are very, very subjective, that creates the conditions like, okay, well, if, you do this for me, I'll do that for you. We've had a couple scandals like that in the province. Again, we currently have one with the Greenbelt. I'm actually surprised that that doesn't happen more often. And I always wonder, okay, is it just that Ontarians are genuinely honest people who wouldn't do that kind of thing? or is a lot of stuff going on that we're just not
Yeah.
catching?
Maybe they're just really good at hiding it. Yeah. Well, I don't know which one it is.
Yeah. It's like, okay, is this corruption not happening, or are we just really good at not getting caught? I don't know which it is, but it is highly problematic. And I think you're absolutely right that it tends to favor the bigger developers who can have a little bit more resources, have those connections, and are able to navigate those systems better than, some mom and pop who just wants to take a single detached home and turn it into a fourplex.
Right. Or even adding like granny suites and stuff like that. Taking an old garage that you don't use anymore because you live in the city and don't even own a car and turning it into an apartment or something like that. Even these things become like incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah, and again, just because the rules tend to be so nebulous, right? So you get the right municipal official on the right day, it sails through. If not, you don't. So,
Right.
And that ends up being reflected in both prices and returns. One of the reasons why home prices have gone up and developers, small scale, large scale, haven't been building that many homes is just there's so much political risk in the system. So they basically are only going to build more homes if that rate of return meets that risk. And, I should add on top of that, and you could say, oh, well, that's a really greedy approach. Even if you have a developer who says, you know what, I'm willing to take the risk myself, I'm willing to take a lower rate of return, they're not going to find a bank that finances them.
That's the trick, right?
Yeah, the bank's going to say, oh, well, this is just too risky. You're not getting the rate of return that's high enough. And that's just not just private banks. That's the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, our government agency that finances a lot of these projects. If you go to them with something with a very small margin, they're going to say, no, we're not going to fund that because there's like a 40% chance you go underwater and we're not going to get our money back.
Yeah. And that also happens. I've heard this from people I know in the real estate in Canada in development. Or I've heard this happen also when they talk about, let's say building something mixed use. Like, let's say a developer that normally does condos or normally does, well, there's only two basically historically over the past, 60 years in Canada. You're either building condo buildings or you're building single family homes and nothing in between. And nobody's built anything in between. And even just going to the bank as an established company that has built one type and saying, oh, we want to build this mixed use development that's going to have commercial and it's going to have residential and it's going to have office and it's all going to be mixed together. The banks look at them and say, you've never built anything like this before. This is like a huge risk that you're going to do this incorrectly. And like, even that, when they want to do it, they can't get the financing for it because it's just too different than anything the banks have seen before. They don't know how to even calculate it. So they don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that happens a lot. And it's one of the things that really is slowing housing innovation in Canada. Where that's coming up a lot is with mass timber type buildings. There's a real push to get sort of 5/1 type mass timber 6-story buildings. They are really hard to both finance because you take it down to your bank and go, okay, well, I don't know how to assess the risk on this because we've never done one of these before. Right. And even if you could do that, then getting the insurance on that building is incredibly difficult because the insurers have no idea how to price that risk. They know if I build a subdivision of single detached homes, they have like 80 years worth of experience. They go, okay, well, I can read a flood map. I know what you're getting into hazards wise.
Yeah.
If you're building a, 5/1 mass timber building in, downtown Sudbury or wherever, they'd have absolutely no idea how to value or risk that. So they just don't fund it. They go fund something else.
The trick. Yeah. So it's kind of one challenge after another here, and maybe we'll get to some of these solutions later. But the other thing I want to talk about that really annoys me about the development in Canada is that it does seem to be just like one development at a time. Like the exurbs are a perfect example, of course, where somebody just comes in, buys the piece of farmland, builds the subdivision on it that's not connected to anything. But I find that a lot of stuff is just a project here, a project there, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of overarching plan as to like, we want the city to develop in this way. And so they say, we want this kind of housing here and this kind of housing there. And in particular, when it comes to transit, like in Canada, I really never see the idea of like, we're going to build a metro line to here. And there's not much there right now, but in our 20-year plan, there's going to be all this stuff here. And I do see that happening more often in the Netherlands, where let's say they'll build a tram line out to literally the middle of nowhere. It's dirt, but they know that the plan is to build a neighborhood around that. And then there's the transit there. And what I always see happen in Canada is it's kind of like stuff just appears all over the place. Pretty much everybody has to drive because there's no alternative when the building's built. And then they come back a couple decades later and go, oh, damn, man, traffic's really bad. We should put some transit in here. I hear that transit fixes traffic. And then they try to just band-aid it on top of the random mess that they've created or let be created.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things we do wrong, I think, in North America is not understand induced demand, particularly actually induced demand for transit.
Right? Induced demand, I've said this before, is not just for cars. It's the one we're most familiar with. You build a highway, a bunch of houses get built along it, the highway gets filled up. That's a standard thing. But exactly, like the idea that you would build transit and then say, because this transit line's here, there's going to be a bunch of development around it. We're going to make it really easy to develop around it. We're going to reduce the restrictions around building around it. And a bunch of people use this transit line.
Well, exactly. And then you could go on top of that even more where, we could build a transit station and then actually the transit provider could build housing themselves on top of it. You've talked about this before. Like, it drives me nuts that GO station in the middle of the green belts.
Oh my God. Bloomingdale GO, I think it's called. Is that what it's called? I'm going to have to look it up.
Yeah.
Is it Bloomingdale?
Yeah. Blooming something, yeah.
Some blooming.
Just that sort of lack of thinking about, okay, how can we integrate housing and transit? But instead, yeah, you're absolutely right. What we do is we wait for these areas to get developed, then try and shoehorn transit in at like 10 times the cost, rather than saying, okay, let's build the transit for, build it and they will come type approach, which would save a whole lot of money and actually give municipalities ability to kind of shape how their cities develop. We simply don't do that. Again, the best case scenario is here in Ottawa when we built the LRT. They did actually intentionally put some stations in areas that are like a sea of single detached homes with the sort of long run thinking that, okay, we'll infill these areas, that kind of thing. But that's become challenging because the people who live in these single detached homes with a subway stop, in walking distance,
right?
They absolutely love it, and understandably so. So they are going to fight tooth and nail any attempts at upzoning or intensification.
Yeah, it's a very, very common thing that I see all through Canada. But that Bloomington GO is the worst example of that, where they literally built a GO station in the Greenbelt where it's illegal to build anything around it. And then it's got the massive parking garage. Because, how else are you going to get there? It's just wild to me.
And it's LEED certified,
Oh, my God, that drove me nuts. It's LEED certified. And the funny thing was I made this joke in my video when I talked about it, because I made a video about the GO train system. And I made this joke that it's LEED certified and that really you shouldn't be able to be LEED certified unless you're right near transit. And then I joked that this would probably still be LEED certified because it's next to a train station. Nothing else around it, but,
Yeah, well, exactly. Like, you have to drive your SUV or whatever to get to this place, but you're saving the environment.
But hey, it's ludicrous. LEED certification because they got like LED lights and stuff like this. But I'm like, come on, this is ridiculous. But again, if they were going to go and say, F the Greenbelt, we're building this thing here, at least what they could have done is built a, walkable neighborhood around it, right? You could build a neighborhood that had a bunch of shops and grocery stores and houses and condos and fourplexes and everything else. And then, yes, that would be fantastic. That would be a great way to build, because not only are you building more housing that we desperately need, you're also building it within walking distance of this new train station that goes straight to Canada's biggest city.
It's absolute madness. And again, it kind of goes back to the sort of original point. We've gotten very good at figuring out what not to do, but we haven't really got good at figuring out what to do. So we're like, okay, building in the Greenbelt's a bad idea, so we're not going to do that. So we'll create an exception for a GO station for some reason. It was such a missed opportunity.
Well, because it's a train station, it's LEED certified, it's environmentally friendly, so it belongs in the Greenbelt.
It's LEED certified, but yeah, we could have used it as a pilot to be like, okay, let's create a walkable, maybe we, go really bold. You know what? We're going to create a car-free community. Right around this train station. And anybody who wants to live here and wants to live a car-free lifestyle, this is the place you go.
Yeah, and you can still have your car that's in the parking garage on the edge of it, but within the community, it's 100% car-free. And I actually have been seeing things like that built in the Netherlands. It's really nice to see. There's one going in by the Rai Convention Center. There's one by the train station in Utrecht. It's great. So they're taking this block of mostly brownfield development stuff that's underused, but it's been developed, bulldozing everything, and then sticking a car-free community on it. And I think that's a fantastic type of development, especially when it's right next to a train station. That's phenomenal.
Yeah. Whereas instead we've got 20 kilometers of nothing in every direction except one road to go to and from the station.
It's wild to me. Anyway, so what are some of the things that you think Canada and Ontario should be doing here? I think some of them are kind of obvious because we've talked about them as problems, but what are some of the things that you think we should be doing to make this easier to build housing?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think it kind of shows that we need a systems level approach, right? We often get this thing of, okay, one simple fix is going to solve this. And if we, I don't know, ban Airbnb or do this or do that, and that's not necessarily that those are bad ideas, but that's not going to change things, right? I think we need to approach all of the issues one by one by one. So, for instance, absolutely, we need big zoning changes to allow for more developments. We need to look at building code. We have some of the strictest rules around, single egress buildings, single stairway apartments in the world. We're starting to see that move a little bit. British Columbia is moving on that. It's a lot of little things. Like North America uses a different elevator standard than the rest of the world. So there's like no competition for elevators in North America. Our prices are like 5 to 10 times higher. That goes through final cost. So stuff like that, building more social housing integrated with transit, I think is a sort of no-brainer. So it's a lot of these little things. Say actually one of the biggest is we have a mindset in North America when it comes, or at least in Ontario, when it comes to financing infrastructure. And it's called growth pays for growth. And the idea of it is that if you're building new housing, that new housing should pay for all the infrastructure, not just like the sidewalks near the place, because that's paid for by the developer themselves, but going, okay, well, more people equals more traffic. So, we're going to assess you that. Or more people means more use of water treatment plants or whatever. But there's problems with that approach because what it does is it piles all the expenses of infrastructure on housing, which raises the cost of building that housing, but also raises the price of all the housing around it because it basically creates a price floor. But I think it's entirely the wrong approach. Like nobody seems to question in Ontario for some reason why houses have to pay for roads. Shouldn't cars pay for roads? Sure, like growth pays for growth, but like the growth of what? It's not the growth of houses that makes us need more roads. It's the growth of cars that makes us need more roads. So I think a lot of it is we need to stop piling all of these requirements on new housing when they have nothing to do with housing. The city of Kitchener is building a $120 million FIFA graded soccer facility, football facility. That's a good thing. I don't want to, get your Dutch listeners mad at me. Football's fantastic. But they're paying for that. 90% of that is getting paid for by development charges on new houses. Like, why? Like, there are better ways to fund soccer facilities than saying, okay, well, that apartment complex we're building over there, they've got to foot the bill. It doesn't make any sense. So I think we have to go through all of these barriers that make it challenging or expensive to build housing and go, do we really need these? Particularly when they're blocking the actual type of housing that we want. What we shouldn't do is go back to what quote unquote worked 20 years ago, which was just, massively expanding urban growth boundaries and just building seas of single detached homes. I don't think that's the right method, but, we kind of replace that with nothing. I think we got to replace that with something.
Yeah, that's the trick, right? The whole idea of new housing creates traffic, so therefore they need to pay for roads is such a toxic thing in North America. And I find this in every conversation I have about housing. There is this inbuilt assumption that more people just means more cars, more traffic, and that people are cars. I mean, because in a lot of Canada, it is car dependent. You can't get around without a car. So I think people have trouble imagining it any other way. Although I also have an issue with some of the people, even the people who work at transit organizations don't take transit. So they still think from a car-centric mindset, which is so unbelievably infuriating. But you see, like Los Angeles has had a lot of trouble with this, where every new development that went in would need to do a traffic study to determine how much car traffic would be created by the new development. And then they would say based on that, well, now you need to widen every road between here and the freeway because we're going to fill up our road and it's your fault. So you need to pay for the road to be widened. Or they would do things where it's like, well, we end up widening the road here, and then this one block has like 6 lanes and the other blocks have 4 because they expect that the other developers will pay for it, the widening as it goes. Again, absolutely insane. But it's this mindset that is like, the only way you're going to get around is by car. And so we're going to load everything on there. But I mean, this really goes back to the fact that one of the reasons why these municipalities have no money, which causes a lot of these problems, is because of all this car infrastructure, because car infrastructure is horrendously expensive. It's just really, really, really expensive. And I know you get the developer to come in and build the road in the first place, but that road needs to be maintained forever. And then it gets full and it needs to get widened and it has flooding issues. So then new flood infrastructure needs to be installed. And it just goes on and on and on and on. Again, this is what Strong Towns talks about. This whole car-centric mindset over the past 60 years has been one of the things that has pushed these municipalities into these financial issues in the first place. And we really have to stop thinking about things in this car-centric way because it's not financially sustainable.
Yeah, that's right. And, how municipalities have solved that is they understood the argument of like, oh, okay, we're undercharging for all of this infrastructure and it's a Ponzi scheme. And basically how they solved it is like, hey, we should be charging more, which
charge the new people more than we used to.
More, yeah.
Still a Ponzi scheme, but now we make more money when they come in.
Yeah, well, exactly. And, you look at the city of Ottawa, which recently increased development charges by about 15 to 20% on the building of new homes. And that got a lot of backlash from YIMBY groups and others who saw it as basically profiting off of a housing crisis and creating more difficulties. And as part, when you raise development charges, cities have to basically come up with like a 10-year plan of like how that money is going to be spent, right? And they basically work backwards. So they go, okay, here's all the money we want to spend. And then we just divide it over the number of homes we think we're going to get. And that's the charge, right? So groups were basically saying like, hey, these development charges are unreasonable. They're going to slow development. They're going to cause ex-urban sprawl. Knock it off. And city councilors were saying, okay, well, but how are we going to pay for this infrastructure? But if you look at what they were actually funding, it was largely the widening of arterial roads.
Yeah.
So a lot of us were just like, hey, like, why are you rising the development charges on building new apartments downtown by the LRT to pay for a bunch of widenings of arterial roads out in the suburbs? So, like, how you should pay for it? Like, just don't pay for it. Like, take these items out of your development charge study. And then, boom, all of a sudden, in fact, you're going to be cutting these charges rather than raising them. But that's essentially what happens. Cities just decide that they need wider and wider and wider stroads. So they throw all of that into their development charge study. And then, that causes these basically taxes to go up. But existing homeowners benefit not just from the fact that they're not paying those taxes, but those taxes, again, create a price floor for existing housing. So, you're kind of Joe homeowner who's been in your home 20 years. And it's like, okay, I'm getting wider roads out of this deal that I don't know how to pay for. And the value of my house just went up 25 grand because development charges just went up 25 grand. So it creates all of these kind of bad incentives.
Well, the other issue is that, I mean, this is one of these things that suburbanites still can't understand, that they're being subsidized by the people who live in urban areas. And this is another example of how that happens, where like the urban areas are fundamentally subsidizing this unsustainable suburban living. And Canada is probably the most suburban country in the world in terms of just the number of people who live in car-dependent places. But what you're talking about also creates this really twisted thing where it becomes even more financially logical to live in suburbia rather than in a more financially sustainable downtown area. And I can't blame people for saying, well, geez, man, I can get such a cheaper house and a bigger house out here. Yeah, it's because you're getting all of these direct and indirect subsidies for living that way. And all that's doing is kicking the can down the road, because now in 30 or 40 years, your new subdivision is going to be even a bigger bill for the city that they're going to have to come up with in some way. And this is where there really have to be more incentives for people to want to live more sustainably. Because the thing is, like, living in a walkable urban area should be a lot cheaper. Like, the amount of infrastructure and everything else that's involved in that is so much lower than living in a suburban single-family home with big roads going to it and power lines and sewage and water and everything else, and then shopping at this huge Walmart and everything else. But we've just set up the incentives to make it a no-brainer that if you're in Canada, you go live in suburbia.
Well, that's the challenge. My neighborhood in Ottawa is called the Glebe,
Right.
which was kind of a streetcar suburb back from 120 years ago. And we specifically live here because we wanted a walkable neighborhood. And there's actually not that many in most Ontario cities, including Ottawa. But the challenge is it's like really freaking expensive,
Yes.
right? My neighbors and I, we're not necessarily one percenters, but maybe in the top five, right? And I'm sure I lost some of your listeners when I say I live in the Glebe. They're like, oh God, oh, he's one of those. But I just look at it, I'm like, okay, well, why can't we build neighborhoods like this anymore where, it's still walkable, there's, a mixed use of housing. But, if you want to have any kind of space and live in a walkable neighborhood, you've got to be in the top 1% to 5% of income, which is just ridiculous. I think it's so beneficial to me and my kids where I can send my daughter down to the grocery store. She can walk to the grocery store, get herself something. And she has a level of independence that like you and I didn't have growing up, and you talk about driving to, I think it was the Wendy's.
Yeah.
And you were 16.
Out on Oxford
Yeah,
Street.
no, I remember that one well
Oxford
with the big
Wonderland,
kind of
yeah.
atrium out front. Yeah, it's such a great way to raise kids, but we've basically eliminated that option from the middle class, which is, I think, is really unfortunate.
Well, I mean, when you're talking about pushing, we have the concept in Ontario, and I don't know how much people talk about this phrase in other places, but drive till you qualify is something we talk about all the time, right? Basically, you just keep driving and driving and driving farther and farther out until you can qualify for a mortgage. And you're putting people effectively, if you can't afford a home in the city, you're going farther and farther and farther away, which is just going to increase your transportation costs. You're now making sure that everybody needs to own a car, not just needs to own a car, multiple cars, and they need to drive them very long distances to do literally anything. So it's just making that element of your expenses that much more expensive. And that is one of the other things that kind of annoys me in Canada is we talk all the time about housing prices, but we don't talk about housing plus transportation prices. Yeah. Because if you live somewhere, if we made it legal to build more places like the Glebe, if you could do that all over, you could build one of those neighborhoods anywhere in Canada, then you could plop that down. And when you live in a place like that, you can get around for free, right? Like you can go to the grocery store for free. Your kids can go to school for free. You can go to work for free. You don't have to pay some fossil fuel company to put fuel in your car. You don't have to pay for maintenance on your car just to live your life. Like that's literally a tax that you're putting on every movement that you have if you live in one of these suburban or ex-urban areas.
Yeah, and we're massively creating all in congestion. And that's actually one of the two ways I kind of got into this housing space in general, because my background is more innovation policy and manufacturing and regional economic development. And I got in this space about a decade ago for a couple of reasons. One was I was doing a project in the GTA helping manufacturers with their labor market shortages. And we were working with a bunch of manufacturers that needed to be near Pearson Airport for like supply chain reasons, doing roundtables and things like that. And one of the things, that kept coming out of these interviews was like, Mike, we can't find anybody to work here because nobody can afford to live here.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a decade ago. But the second thing that really turned me into a housing guy, somewhat unwillingly, is in 2017, we left fake London. We were living in the kind of old North neighborhood by St. Joe's Hospital. Again, kind of another kind of walkable neighborhood, at least by fake London standards. And we sold the place and moved to Ottawa. We're working with a real estate agent who suggested a price that I thought was just unreasonably high. I'm like, we're never going to get that. It's never going to happen. And she's like, no, trust me. And I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. You know what you're doing. I won't try and second guess. Well, it turns out we ended up getting 3 different offers and a lot of people who were kicking tires. But the interesting thing to me was that all 3 offers came from people who were currently living in the city of Toronto and either had a newborn or a baby along the way. And what they were doing was they still worked in Toronto. They weren't coming to London to work.
That's wild.
That drive until you qualify, and again, for your non-Ontario listeners, that's 195 kilometers. Let's be precise here.
Yeah.
You go from City Hall in Toronto to City Hall in London, Ontario, 195 kilometers. But the price differential was so high, and, some of these folks may have, been hybrid working, things like that. So that drive until you qualify is not just like, okay, people going from the downtown of a city to the suburbs, but they're going, 50, 100, in some cases 200 kilometers away because those price differentials are so high. But what happens then is that raises the price in fake London and displaces the residents of fake London who are now having to move out to like Sarnia or someplace like that.
And they don't make enough money in London, in fake London, to be able to afford those prices at all, right? Like the salaries in London just aren't that high.
Well, absolutely. So basically the homes in fake London end up being priced at Toronto wages. So the people who are actually earning London wages end up moving to St. Thomas or Chatham or Sarnia or so on. One of the things I always like to point out is that I think the largest employer in Tillsonburg, Ontario is probably the hospital in Kitchener, right? Because that's the one place that the nurses could actually afford to live in. So we create, I call it the musical chairs effect, and it creates this kind of cascade of commuting where everybody is, or at least a lot of folks are living in one city or town and working in another. And, you know, the incomes of the smaller city get detached from, or the home prices in the smaller city get detached from incomes. Yeah. So it creates this just massive commuting, which we basically fund through building larger arterial roads, causing development charges to go up and causing housing to be more expensive.
And highways and everything else, because all of those people now are on the roads that they shouldn't be. And of course, there's no public transit.
Well, do you remember living in London and driving to Toronto as a kid back in the 80s and when the traffic started?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Like just geographically?
Yes. Like it was mostly into like Mississauga or something.
Yeah, like exactly. Like traffic didn't get busy until you could actually see the CN Tower.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, sometimes it really was at Etobicoke. Like you were in the Toronto, the amalgamated Toronto borders.
Yeah, Metro Toronto then. Yeah. Whereas now it's like you get to like Milton and, you know, you're 40, 50 kilometers away and, you know, everything just grinds to a halt. And we have twice as many lanes as we did back in the 80s too.
Well, I'm sure one more lane will fix it.
Yeah, exactly. If we had 3 times as many, we'd be golden.
I mean, there'd be no city left, but it's fine. We got a highway. No. But it drives me crazy every time I come back to Toronto now because I want to go see my parents in London, Ontario. And we always look at it and we're like, how are we going to get there? What are we going to do? Because there's no good option for getting around at all. We know like Via Rail sucks. It is a pain in the ass. And I've talked about that over and over and over again. There aren't enough trains. It's expensive. And now they've got this ridiculous luggage policy. I'm not going to get into it. It makes me angry. So then we think, well, are we going to rent a car? But then you look at the cost of renting the car, but also the traffic is insane getting out of Toronto. So we might have been able to do the drive in less than 2 hours before. There's no way in hell we're doing it in less than 2 hours.
Yeah, there's no options.
There's no options. No. And again, it's all of this is all interrelated because, you know, I'm stuck in traffic behind somebody who bought your house in London, Ontario and who works in Toronto, right? Like it's craziness. It's absolute craziness. But you talked about the price of the house that you bought in London. What was it? $130,000?
$168,000.
Yeah. So how much do you think that house would go for today?
It's about triple. The nice thing is that because these are all kind of cookie cutter homes, there's so many of that model out there and available. So if you went on like realtor.ca or any of the websites, it's about $650,000 today. And, you know, to put that in context, inflation on everything else has gone up about 50%. And we finished the basement, did some work on it. So if it had just risen at the rate of inflation and, you know, took into account the extra work we put in it, 275 might be sort of a reasonable level, and it's twice that. It'd be somewhere in the 650 to 700,000 range.
And I've seen homes going for over $1 million in London, which is just blows my mind because those really are Toronto prices.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you see that in small communities, and yeah, you know, you don't want to be rude about it, but you're like, people are paying $1 million to live here. Really? Yeah, it's ridiculous. And, you know, part of what motivates me to do the housing work that we do is I just realized that, again, when I bought that house, I was 27 years old. Today, if I was starting my career, I couldn't have bought that at 37. We've locked that past the things that you do as you're growing up and reaching adulthood. And I would have never been able to afford a home. And we've created conditions where it matters more and more that you've chose the right parents, that they're wealthy and actually willing to give you money. Like nobody in Ontario these days is going through school, going through university, and then buying a home on their own, right? That was common for us kind of Gen Xers, but for, the sort of Gen Z, that's just not happening.
No, because I was looking at entry level salaries in, even getting an electrical engineering degree like I did. I came out at a pretty decent salary in 2000. But looking at the salaries that electrical engineers are getting today, it's maybe 10, 20% above what I was getting in 2000. So like the salaries have barely moved for entry level positions, and yet the housing is 3, 4, 5 times as expensive. And this is where like society breaks down when this happens, right? Like, again, if you don't have the rich parents, if you can't borrow from the bank of mom and dad, you're screwed. And like, this is just a massive problem. And I want to see this fixed because I worry about the future of Canada and lots of other places too. It's not like Canada is the only one with a terrible housing crisis. As I said, we see it here as well. But, I also used to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was the same insanity. It was just moved forward by about 20 years.
Well, exactly. I often get asked by people, it's like, okay, well, if we don't fix this in the Toronto area, what are things going to look like? And I'm like, they're going to look like San Francisco. Yeah. Like that's, you just kind of look at what's happened there and you forward the clock. But I really worry about this a lot because, as I mentioned before, Canada is also going through a large population boom. We've increased immigration targets. We have a big international student boom and so on. And it's creating the conditions now where people are basically going, well, those people over there are the reason why I can't own a home.
Right. And we see the same thing happening here.
Yeah. And that really worries us. Now, so far, for the most part in Canada, the discussion has been very sort of pragmatic and I would say largely not racist, where, people are saying, okay, well, we need to align immigration targets with availability of housing and healthcare and so on, blaming policy, not blaming individuals. But I do worry if this goes on longer, you start to get the kind of anti-immigration sentiment. Like Canada hasn't reached the levels that we see, say, in the UK, but there's no reason why we couldn't. And I think that would be an incredibly dangerous thing for us. We've built our country on immigration in Canada. We had like a 60-year consensus about the importance of being welcoming to newcomers. And I really fear that we're losing that. And that's, one of the things that kind of keeps me up at night about this crisis.
Yeah, and it would be so stupid because, again, the issue is that we've made it basically impossible to build housing over the past 20 or 30 years, other than sprawling single-family homes. And as you said, now we're making that difficult. So, where are we going? But this is a massive subject and we'll never get through it here. I know I'd like to go on your podcast sometime and talk about some of these other issues as well. But where can people, if people have made it this far, where can people find out more about this stuff? Let's start with your podcast, but then anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. So our podcast is called The Missing Middle with Kara Stern and Mike Moffatt. Available on all of your favorite podcast apps. As well, we have a YouTube version, so you can see us in video, which is very exciting. I'm still one of the weirdos who's left on Twitter/X. I know you kind of noped out.
Yeah, I was out of there. I had too much.
I envy you every single day because I kind of still need to be on there to promote our work because it's my day job. I have employers, that kind of thing. So you can find me there at Mike P. Moffatt with 2 F's and 2 T's. We promote a lot of our work there. But yeah, these are the kinds of issues we discuss on the podcast. And we'd love if you subscribe, or leave a comment because I'm told that helps us with the algorithm.
All right. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to The Urbanist Agenda. As usual, all new episodes will be available early on Nebula. So if you're not already a Nebula subscriber, now might be a good time. You can sign up at nebula.tv/agenda. And with a subscription to Nebula, you not only support this podcast, you also get access to content by over 150 creators. That's everything from videos to podcasts to classes and more. Nebula is also constantly adding new Nebula originals, which are high-budget productions on a wide range of interesting topics. If you use our link, which again is nebula.tv/agenda, you'll get a discount on a yearly subscription, which brings it down to only $30 a year. I'm a big fan of Nebula, which is why all of my Not Just Bikes videos are available there, as well as some that are only available on Nebula, and of course, all episodes of The Urbanist Agenda. So if you're not already a Nebula subscriber, go check it out today, and thanks again for listening.